Shalom. Welcome to the Chai Center. I hope hope you can hear me today better than yesterday. Um, New setting for this thing, so hopefully you can hear fine. So we have been discussing history and history of the modern day Israel history, its founding, if you will. Not so modern anymore, right? So the yesterday we discussed the Knesset. We also discussed the fact that the Jews came in from various places and the DP camps were closed, and Israel doubled its inhabitants in just over 30 months. They went from 600,000 to 1.2 million, literally in a few months. Today, today we're going to talk about. So yesterday we spoke about the Knesset mainly, the Knesset, how it's formed, how it's modeled after the it's modeled after the British Parliament, and it's a very interesting way. The United States has three branches of government. Essentially, you only have one branch of government. Of course, yeah, you have the Supreme Court, but in terms of anybody that's elected, so here you have Senate and Congress and the president. Over there, it's just you just have what you have. So there is a Supreme Court, but but in addition but here you have that in addition as a branch of government. So the judicial branch they do have in Israel, but the executive branch and and Congress are all one entity. That's what we discussed yesterday, and we went into detail and about the acrimony and how every party, in order to form a majority of 61 seats, you need to make deals with the other smaller parties, and there are a host of smaller parties. Arabs have about 10 seats, Orthodox Jews have about 20 seats, and then you have the two major branches, Likud and Marach, Labor and Conservative. They have generally they get the most seats, but they never gotten the majority by themselves. There was once a time, I think it was in the 80s, where because they couldn't really form a government, nobody had, and this one had 60 with deals, and this one had 60, so they actually had a unity government where 2 years Labor, 2 years Conservative, and then they went for elections. So I'm hoping that today you can hear me better than you did yesterday. Today's topic is called the Tzahal. The Tzahal is an acronym of three words, just like the I.D.F is, and it means the same thing: Israel Defense Force. Tzava Hagana LeYisrael. Israel Defense Force. The I.D.F prides itself on it fights only in defense of Israel. It may send its army out to help other countries, but as far as fighting, as far as warring, it's only in defense of Israel. It will not seek any preemptive attack unless it's in defense of Israel. It won't go warring. We think about Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and he invaded Kuwait. Israel doesn't do anything like that. Their I.D.F, their military, is strictly in defense. Now, the I.D.F, as we've discussed in previous classes at the Chai Academy, the I.D.F was comprised of basically four factions of different groups that were eventually unified. So you had the Igun, Menachem Begin. You had the Lehi, which is the Stern Gang. You had the Haganah, which was Ben Gurion, and you had the Palmach. Once Israel declared their independence, they all forged into one army. And this is Ben Gurion's insistence, by the way, that there's not two different armies. There's one army. It's interesting to note about this army is that even though Ben Gurion was not a religious man, and even though Ben Gurion, once again, he used to study the Tanakh and he used to study the scriptures, etc., but he himself was secular. But he knew if he was going to make this army for all people, he had to have a kosher army, a kosher kitchen in the army. The mess hall had to serve kosher food. Even today, there's signs that in Israel, in the army, that says, keep kosher. That's an order. So the army is actually a kosher kitchen, and that way everybody can even if you're not kosher, so you eat kosher food. If you are kosher, you have what to eat. The Israel's, of course, their first war was the War of Independence, and that was in 1948, and that lasted till 1949. They had, of course, the I.D.F. They had the Suez Canal War, right? The Suez War, as it's called, in 1956. They had the Six-Day War, 1967. You had the War of Attrition, which is from Egypt. It was with Egypt. That took place from 68 to 70. They had the Yom Kippur War, where they were caught by surprise. That was 1973. And then you had something called the Lebanon War in 1982. Now, all the aforementioned, except for the Lebanon War, all the aforementioned was strictly in defense. The Lebanon War was also in defense. However, Israel was greatly criticized. I could care less really from without, because there's no love lost between many countries and Israel, but from within. Because the Lebanon War, Israeli citizens felt that Israel went too far, and therefore Israel was criticized. Because as we said, it is only for defense. So anything you go above defense, now defense could be rooting out terror. Defense could be a preemptive attack. So that's fine. But if you go beyond defense and you go, and you attack something, and it's not because of defense, but rather it's because your enemy, that is frowned on in Israel. Loss of life is frowned on. To quote Golda Meir, she said, I can forgive the Arabs for killing our children. I cannot forgive them for making us kill their children. Right? It's there's a lot of morality. Now, there are bad eggs. Of course, there are bad eggs. You have soldiers that they go off the range, right? And they do things. But for the most part, Israel has a very clear mandate. Their rules of engagement are very, very strict. But if it's in defense of Israel, then no bars held. Pretty much their wars that they've had have been they've been victorious. The Arabs have not won any war, right? You can't argue that the latest one with Gaza, where Gaza sent so many rockets into Israel, and Israel punished Gaza, but it didn't stop the rockets. You could say the Arabs won that one because they didn't really deter, even though it has lately been quieter than usual. But they've also had miracles. I mean, the Six-Day War was clearly a miracle. There's an old joke out there. The joke is that how did Israel win the war in 6 days? Because they rented the tanks for a week. They got the week price. One of the greatest miracles and greatest accomplishments, if you remember, was Entebbe. Entebbe took place in 1976. And what they did was amazing. That's when Bibi Netanyahu's brother was killed. He was the only soldier casualty. was Bibi Netanyahu's brother, but it was executed. Basically, it took place in Uganda at the Entebbe airport, and Premier Idi Amin Dada from Uganda was aligned himself with Israel, and they kidnapped. They hijacked the plane. They separated Jews from non-Jews, and 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 it was a, hey Bonnie, good to see you as well. And Israel did something remarkable. What they did was basically they did a mock-up of Idi Amin's car, and they flew it all the way to Uganda, and they had soldiers. So when it came to the airport, the Ugandan soldiers, the terrorists, etc., thought that it was Idi Amin. They were letting him in, but really it was a Trojan horse. And the Israeli army, they got out everybody. I believe there was one woman who Golda Bloch is her name. I believe she died, and she's still in Uganda, I believe. But everybody else was saved, and it was considered a miracle. Interesting to note, the only time women fought in the Israeli army, fought on the front lines, was in the War of Independence. A big shout out, Mazel Tov, to Bonnie. Bonnie, who listens to our broadcast daily. Her grandson got married to a girl from Australia, so Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov. So females were not. 1948 they fought, but and basically in 1949 it was they said that the women have to stop fighting, and it wasn't based. It was nothing based on any misogyny. What it was is they were so afraid that if a woman was captured, what the enemy would do with her, would rape her, and sexually disgrace her, etc. So it was that was the reason they wanted to protect the dignity. When a guy gets captured, so they either kill him or they starve him or they hold him as. But a woman, they were worried that they were going to take advantage. Essentially, a woman is drafted in non-combat. The women are drafted. It's a 2-year stint, whereas men, it's a 3-year stint. Now, both women and men can get an exemption. So, women, for example, if they're religious, if they're married, they do not have to serve. Men can get a religious exemption. By the way, anybody can get an exemption if your health is bad, but men can get a religious exemption, and they can get a patur. Once again, mental health, they can get a patur also, but when we say religious exemption, it's only if you are a full-time student for religious exemptions. It was a deal that was struck in Ben Gurion's time. And the deal was, and remember at that time there was only probably 10,000 people studying there, that if you study in yeshiva you don't have to go. Now, you got a million studying. So now actually there's some discord. Bibi wants he understands that there is a certain element of those that should study in yeshiva. They are the creme de la creme, but if you're not a serious student, then go to the army, right? And I concur with that, but many don't. And there are plenty of Orthodox Jews, especially from Chabad, that do go to the army. Mizrahi go to the army, and there's many things you can do in the army, by the way. A lot of the much of the reasons why religious women, not all, but many, we shouldn't generalize, why many religious women don't go to the army, is because their families don't like the idea of Israeli male soldiers hanging out with Israeli female soldiers, as it can lead to mixed dancing, if you get my drift. So it is so that's the concern, that they feel that it's a little loosey goosey in the army, and everybody sleeps with everybody. I don't know if that's true, but that is part of the reason. In the army, it's interesting the way Israel operates. In the army, there's about 175 to 200,000 full-time soldiers. However, those are, by the way, you get drafted. You get drafted when you're 18. So girls 18 to 20, boys 18 to 21. Then you go to college. Then you start your college or start your life. Many Israelis, after they leave the army, they before they start their life, they go out. They leave Israel, and they go backpacking, especially where the shekel can go far. They go to South America. They go to Thailand, Kathmandu. That's why you always hear about the 2,000 person Seder in Kathmandu. The reason is because it's all Israeli backpackers who've just left the army. I remember before I became a hired in Dix Hills, I went for 5 weeks to Ecuador and Bolivia. So I went to Quito and Guayaquil, and I went to Cochabamba and Santa Cruz, right, and La Paz. I went for 6 weeks, and I met an incredible amount of Israelis. And when they came to our hotel room, and for Shabbat dinner, that's because they were backpacking after the army. However, they have something called Miluim, reserves. Basically, once you leave the army, you have to come for 1 month a year. Can you imagine what that does to the economy? 1 month a year, you don't go to work. So you may be an engineer, but you don't go to work because you have to go to the reserves. So you go to the reserves until you're 41 if you're a combat soldier, or 47, I believe, if you're a non-combat soldier. And it's 30 days a year. So if you think about it, it's like, and then they get to 600,000, 650,000 soldiers with the Miluyim. So full time is 175 to 200,000. Now, if you think about it, 5% of the workforce is out in any given month because they're on the reserves. But the reserves keep them fresh. It keeps them fit. It keeps them sharp, etc. And it's actually, it's really sad that it has to happen if you think about it. Some people say that the Miluyim helps marriages because you have abstention 1 month a year. You are 1 month a year you're separated from your spouse, so when you come back, it's like a reunion, and it's like it's absence makes the heart fonder. I don't know. I would like to ask actually an Israeli woman directly what she feels about the Miluyim, where a husband goes for 30 days. I do know that there are children's books out there, children's books, right? If there would just be no wars, right? There's children's books that say living without daddy for a month. Children's books about the trauma that the kids know that their daddy, their daddy has to leave for 30 days annually. So that is pretty much the I.D.F. When a soldier, by the way, and there was a story recently, a couple of years ago, just to show you how moral. Aside from they throw leaflets in Gaza to say we're going to bomb this area because there are rockets and Katyusha rockets and missiles and Scuds coming from this area, so they let them know in advance they're going to bomb it. Which is incredible. I mean, who does that? We're going to bomb this area tonight. So the idea is that they won't be able to take all their equipment, their heavy missile launching equipment, with them. That's the idea. But they don't want to kill civilians. But a few years ago, there was a terrorist that was he stabbed a terrorist stabbed a soldier, and he was neutralized. In other words, he was shot, and he was alive. And then the soldier went over to him again and shot him again. That soldier was court-martialed. Even though it was, this guy just stabbed, I don't remember if he killed his thing, but he stabbed his soldier next to him. But because he shot twice, the second time was when the guy was already down, he was court-martialed. They take this stuff very seriously. They don't want for there to be a breakdown in they have deep moral convictions, right? Deep moral convictions, and they want to make sure that there's no moral rot. Now, moving on to one of the best known people, and by the way, this is the funny thing with how many generals do you know in the United States? How many generals? So we know Norman Schwarzkopf, right? And I don't know who else. I don't, but so we know in Israel, any kid or any adult can list off, 20, 30 generals because it's part of their life and they look up to their generals. One of the greatest generals was Moshe Dayan. I will tell you, he's not my personal hero. I have major gripes with Moshe Dayan's some of the things he did. But let's talk about him. So he died in 1981. Firstly, he was such an incredible general. Is that I forget which president of the United States told Golda Meir, he says that if you give me General Dayan, you can have your pick of 3 generals. So she said, deal. I want General Electric, General Motors, and General Dynamics. That was the famous joke of her. So Moshe Dayan, he was an incredible, and he had an eye for this. And when it came to the 67 war, right? He decided that he's going to do a preemptive strike. And that saved an incredible amount of lives. There were five. By the way, in the War of 1948, he was in the Jordan Valley. He was in Jerusalem. In 1967, he also drew the famous picture of him with the patch. And by the way, you know about his patch, right? His patch was not from Israel. He didn't lose his eye in Israel. He actually lost it in World War II. He lost it in World War II in Britain. Anyway, so what happens is that he was actually retired before 1967, and then came the 6-Day War. So the Prime Minister, Levi Eshkol, who was the Prime Minister and he was the Secretary of Defense, and both. He had both things, right? He was and he was doing both, and it wasn't looking good. The armies were gathering, and it didn't look good. And he was urged to hire General Dayan, who was in retirement. So he went over to him and he hired him. And that's when he did his famous preemptive strike. When he did his preemptive strike, he basically saved the day because he allowed Israel to really attack a lot of the tanks and the armaments. There were plenty of miracles that happened in 1967, plenty, right? And plenty of mistakes that the Arabs made. And they actually got spooked because they were going from south to north, and they weren't meeting any resistance. They thought it was they were going to be attacked. It was going to be an ambush. Truth be told, there was no Israeli tanks down there. So there were miracles that occurred and blunders, but Dayan did preemptive strike, and they say that that's what actually helped win the war. However, the Yom Kippur War, he made a major blunder. As I said, they were caught by surprise, and this is one of the greatest failings, I think, of the Israel army was the Yom Kippur War. They were attacked on Yom Kippur. They did not think, and Dayan specifically, this is not why I don't like him, by the way. I'll talk to you about him in a minute. But Dayan specifically said Egypt will never attack. They'll never attack. They'll never attack. And guess what? They attacked. And the first few days of fighting, Moshe Dayan was blamed for 2,700 soldiers dying in the first few days. And when he used to walk in the streets, instead of him being this hero, back then during the Yom Kippur War, he was he was called a murderer by people who had lost, because they felt it was his fault, that so many soldiers died. Um, he was a major labor guy, major labor guy. However, to his credit and the credit of Menachem Begin, in 1977, when Likud finally took power, as we discussed a previous time, is because the Sephardim felt out that they were ignored, and Begin felt he was ignored. They joined together and they took power. Um, he appointed Moshe Dayan, who had been a lifelong labor guy, to be his general. Right? Just it shows you the character of Begin. Ben Gurion would never have done that. Just to tell you another quick story of Begin. Begin actually, when Ben Gurion went retired, and I forget which war it was, Begin traveled down south. He traveled to Ben Gurion and says, "I'm begging you, please come out of retirement and lead our country again." Remember, they were mortal enemies. Ben Gurion tried to kill Begin a number of times. Mortal enemies. And Ben Gurion said, if I would have known Begin better in 1948, we would have been friends. We would have had a different, because, truth is, it's an incredible story. There were enemies, arch enemies. But Begin traveled to his house to ask him to come out of retirement and lead the country as prime minister. Amazing. Anyway, Dayan was a archaeologist. In addition to being a general, he found stuff. That was his hobby. He had two hobbies, by the way. War was his vocation, was his job. Peace was his obsession, and archaeology was his hobby. That's what they say about him. He also used to plant tomatoes, cherry tomatoes, which were invented in Israel. He used to like planting them, but when they actually grew, they grew very hard, like stones. And so when anybody ever bought a hard cherry tomato, they used to call it, Moshelas. These are Moshelas. So he was an archaeologist, and he used to sign the archaeology, and he made a lot of money. He used to sell it. A true hero of the Jewish people. The reason why I have a problem with him, it was because in 1967, a war that he won clearly, he made a decision. First in Jerusalem, when they won, and they won Jerusalem, and they won the Temple Mount, and a soldier went up on the Temple Mount and put an Israeli flag, and Dayan said, "Take it down, take it down. The Temple Mount we're going to give to the Waqf. We're going to give to the Arabs that they can run it." To me, how dare he? Remember, we weren't allowed to see the Western Wall from 48 to 67. Jordanians did not honor the armistice. And when Dayan gets there, right, he should have said, "Okay, well, let them see it, but they're not going to run it." Then, no, he made them take the flag down. I really have an issue with him over that. The other issue I have is in the same Six-Day War, when Hebron was the chief rabbi, Shlomo Goren, the chief rabbi of Israel. What happened was he was in Hebron, and the Waqf, those that run the holy sites, they come to him and they said, and you couldn't go to the cave of Machpelah, to the Patriarch cave. You could not go when it was run by the Waqf. And now that the Jews ran it, they came to him with a white paper, and surrender. And they said, and they gave him a piece of paper that said, however, it's a holy site for us too, please allow us to see it. So the chief rabbi, Shlomo Goren, tore it up. He tore up the paper. He said, "How dare you? How dare you? You didn't allow us to come in here And now you make demands of me? How dare you? And he tore it up. The next day in the paper, in the Israeli paper, Moshe Dayan apologized for the chief rabbi's behavior. And he said, of course you're going to be allowed to go, and of course you're going to be allowed to run it. To this day, you want to go visit the grave of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rivka, and Leah, you have to go through Waqf security. They are there to make sure that you don't cause trouble. To me, that's very disheartening. It's very distasteful. And I believe he was a peacenik at all costs. But this was giving away our soul. So I'm fond of him as a general. I'm not fond of his extremely progressive tactics where he took away authority over the Temple Mount from us. And he took away also from the cave of our forefathers, the ancient burial place where we were both places prohibited from going. Nowadays, if you want to go on the Temple Mount, you have to go through the Waqf, and they tell you you're not allowed to pray at all. If we catch you praying, you get thrown off. So a Jew is not allowed to pray on the Temple Mount. You tell me if that makes sense. And this we can credit General Dayan. If you have any questions, Rabbi at the Chai Center, comments, etc., or you can leave them here. If you wish to see previous episodes of the Chai Academy, it's thechai.com/Chai. I'm sorry, it's thechai.com/Academy. And there's a couple hundred courses, classes on a myriad of topics of Jewish interest. And we will continue, please God, with our history class of modern day Israel tomorrow at 1 p.m. God bless.